Oh boy, this one's gonna be interesting. This is gonna be interesting. So when it comes to who the... Shh. Please. I'm filming. Birds. So there's basically three camps to what people claim the Byzantines, or more correctly, the medieval Romans, culture was. The vast majority and the norm since the beginning was that it was Greek culture and Greek civilization, even though it's the Roman Empire. But of course, academia and modernists have to take what is normal and completely screw it around and twist it and win awards in mental gymnastics for whatever reason to say otherwise. And that's what's going on. The two other camps are in that category. So the other two new theories is that one, they were multicultural, multi-ethnic and all that jazz. And then the third one is that they were Western Roman in their culture, like old Roman in their culture, because they're Romans, therefore old Roman. Oh my gosh. Only in this field are people confused about the culture of a major civilization. It's nuts, man. Now the answer is obvious to anyone who studied even a modicum of the medieval Roman period, and for people who are just honest, all right? Because the others are ideologically motivated. And even though the Roman answer is mostly by Romaboos, like Romaboo Ramblings, who are just Roman fanboys, the equivalent of weeaboos, where they get their sources, especially Caldelus, which is what Romaboo is quoting mostly, it's ideologically motivated. But even Caldelus gets it right compared to the multiculturalists, who I'm going to debunk right now. The Byzantines, the medieval Romans, were not unique for being multicultural or multi-ethnic. That's the definition of an empire, dipshit. You have a bunch of ethnicities that you're ruling over. Like, this is just stupid. This is so stupid. And you're not multicultural because you don't assimilate every single frickin' ethnic group that you've taken over. Or else it would just be one ethnic group at that point, and it wouldn't be an empire. Oh my gosh. The Byzantines had their own culture, okay? And even Anthony Caldelus points this out. There are so many references to Roman clothing, and that being very distinct. And even Constantine Porphyrogenitos, emperor of the 10th century, writes how Romans should be like the animals and not intermix and marry with the other. Wow! Yeah, this ain't politically correct, man. But that's how they viewed it. They viewed themselves as an ethnic group, okay? And their culture as Roman culture. But what is Roman culture? Look, I don't care if you think multiculturalism is a good thing. There is an argument to be made for that. But don't you dare put it in the history where it doesn't belong or it doesn't exist. I love Greece. I love ancient Greece. I love everything about it. But I'm not going to make excuses and pretend that dudes, grown men, didn't diddle little kids. Okay? That's what they did. And I have to suck up that horrible, disgusting fact. Okay? I'm not going to go make excuses to why they didn't, right? When they clearly did, just because I like it. It's the same freaking thing. If you like multiculturalism, if you like Eastern cultures, if you like Roman culture, guess what? That's fine. Nothing's wrong with it. But don't put it where it doesn't belong. That's cultural appropriation first off, all right? Because guess what? The inheritors of the empire of the Greeks still exist. We're here. Hello? Yeah, don't take our culture. I'm including myself in this one. That's why I don't understand. These goobers are acting like Greeks don't exist. They tried to assimilate everyone that they could. They preferred to. And they looked down. They were really racist, man. They really thought highly of themselves and lowly of everyone else. Definitely not the definition of multicultural like Timothy Dawson loves to claim. Yes, I'm calling out names. You need to know who to avoid. Who's honest, who's dishonest, okay? But Caldelus, even though I don't agree with everything in this paper, he does have a great paper on clothing, Byzantine or Roman clothing. I'll have a link of it in the description below. You guys can go check it out in full. The one thing I do not agree on is that on the periphery of the empire, clothing was the same, he claims, as in everywhere. If you're not a walled-in country like North Korea, you're going to have influence on the periphery, on the borders from the neighboring cultures. It's just inevitable. So outside of that, it's a great paper, and he shows, though, how people distinguish themselves ethnically from their clothing. And it's a big deal. I was reading the Scalitsi's Chronicle, and it talked about how Boris actually got shot by a Bulgar because when he was entering into Bulgaria, he was dressed as a Roman. So that shows you it can be deadly. The difference can be deadly. Dionysius talks about it, Roman clothing. And they even talk about here, Romeo Yenin. They say, I love the Roman to my own despite. Romeo Yenin, Yenos, race. So it's one word, but it's the Roman, like Roman ethnic, ethnically Roman. So yeah, these multiculturalists, it's so blatantly, obviously false. I don't know why these guys take them seriously at all. And they think they know Romans. Here's the thing. If you're not Orthodox and Greek, then you're an outsider looking in. I'm sorry. That's just the facts. That's just the way it is, okay? If you don't have the mindset and the phronema of an Orthodox person in the Greek community and Greek culture, you do not think even remotely close to the way they did. It's just the way it is. But enough of that obvious garbage. That's obviously not true. We're going to easily debunk this and see what the culture actually was.
Now, pardon the unprofessionalism here. I am not trying, I swear, to copy Faria Fariji. It just happens to look like that. I'm serious. Well, maybe I am. But anyway, yeah, you're going to see a few of these cell phone vids just to give a little bit more extra context to what I'm talking about.
Now, because the Byzantine Empire is actually the Roman Empire, the early period is going to be traditionally Roman, and there's no clean cutoff. So it's going to be a gradual change. So most people consider, and rightfully so, the Middle Byzantine period to be peak Byzantine culture. So that's mainly what we're going to be focusing on. And wherever the Byzantines natively lived is where their culture was. So that's mainly Greece and Cyprus, Thrace, Anatolia, and bits of southern Italy and Sicily as well. And we should try to remember this and differentiate as much as we can the culture that is unique to Constantinople to the rest of the Byzantine Empire and the civilization. Because while Constantinople kind of defines Byzantine culture and civilization, it does in the same way that New York City defines American culture, even though it is radically different than small town, let's say, Southern or Western America, even though those are equally as American as New York. They're totally stereotypically American, but they're two very different realities and cultures within the same megaculture. So in the same way, we should look at that. And I don't think it would be surprising that the Roman aspects of the Byzantine culture is much more apparent in Constantinople than other places, let's say Cappadocia or Corinth. And cultural elements that are both Roman and Greek are not considered inherited from Roman if the origin of that thing is Greek and it is still used by the Greeks living in that culture. Then it counts as a Greek inheritance and not a Roman one. And I know the Roman boos love to say that everything is Roman, that the Romans use, but it's not. I even saw, like, for example, guys, I literally saw a Roma boo online, a certain one, who said on the forum that Homer and all the Greek literature isn't Greek, but it's actually Roman literature. Homer is Roman literature. Remember, the Romans themselves, the Latins, even admitted that they were enchanted and conquered by Greek culture. If the Latins can admit that it's Greek culture, then certainly the Greeks in the Roman Empire can admit it's Greek culture and not Roman. Like, my gosh. There may be a lot of overlap, but that does not mean it's Roman in its culture, okay? Here's an example to show you just how ridiculous the Romano-centric view of this is. Let's put it in contemporary terms. Pizza is eaten by pretty much everyone across the world, right? But everyone still knows it's Italian, okay? It's Italian in culture. The English eat pizza. And now let's say that the British Empire, which still exists, by the way, in the more traditional sense, right, took over and conquered Italy. And then time passes, and then all of a sudden, the capital of the empire, of the British Empire, moves from England to Italy, Rome, Italy. And that's now the new capital of the British Empire. Then all of a sudden, the empire pretty much shrinks to Italy and the surrounding area. The main population is Italian, and the official language becomes Italian of the British Empire now. Would you consider pizza British? No! Of course not. You'd be a goober, a monkey, a moron to think that, right? No one would think that. They wouldn't go, oh, well, pizza's British because the British Empire ate pizza and it still does, mate. Like, you would not say that. You would not say that. You would say it's Italian culture. Why are we taking them seriously? We shouldn't. It's still Greek culture. Even though now that the Greeks are pretty much the Romans, it's still Greek culture, okay? And if you're going to say it's Roman culture, that would assume that Roman is synonymous with Greek in that sense. But Urban Dictionary seems to know Romaboost quite well. All right, so now we're going to go through the categories of culture and see what it was. Now, the religion is unique. It's Christianity. Now, while Christianity more fulfills the culture's paganness and fulfills it, doesn't totally get rid of it, it's definitely not pagan. It's not Greek pagan. It's not Roman pagan. And to those idiots who go, oh, you can't be a real Greek or a real Roman if you're not part of the ancient religion. You can't be Greek if you're not a Greek pagan. Those LARPers, here's one thing I got to say to you. The philosophers, too, didn't believe in the pagan gods. Most of them didn't and thought it was stupid. Are they not Greek now? The most famous of Greeks? It's kind of like democracy. Yeah, Greeks invented philosophy and democracy, but their wisest philosophers hated it.
People make a really big deal out of the transition from Latin to Greek as the dominant language. Greek has been used in the administration of the empire way before Heraclius, and some ceremonial Latin continued to be employed centuries after his reign. Romans speaking Greek was a thing ever since the conquest of Greece. People as undeniably Roman as Julius Caesar and Augustus spoke Greek at home more often than Latin. In the late Republic, one practically had to be fluent in Greek to receive a quality education.
Romaboo here is totally downplaying how important language is. Most of these beliefs are molded by the Greek language, and its entire ethos is Greek because it has to be. Language is extremely powerful. When you speak a different language, you start to think differently, and it is very true with Greek. And this is why it's so different than what Romaboo is saying. Who cares if Julius Caesar spoke Greek at home? That's not your average Roman peasant, okay? That's an educated man. But now we have the most high people, the emperors speaking Greek, down to the lowest peasant as their native tongue and nothing else. For the Romans, you're like, oh, well, they spoke Greek too. Yeah, Latin first, Greek second. These guys, it's not even Greek first, Latin second. It's just Greek. They don't know Latin. The perspective of the everyday person is Greek because it has to be. Yeah, and yes, the East Roman Empire always spoke Greek because guess what? Greek culture dominated, and they, like the Jews, would not be assimilated into the Roman culture. Like, come on. Greek replaced Latin, okay? And obviously it is, because even with this old map that he puts up, yeah, you divide the Latin West with the Greek-speaking East. That tells you already that there's a division. It is a big deal. And they admit it's a big deal. Emperor Claudius asked an envoy a question in Latin, and because this Lycian Greek didn't understand the Latin, he took away his citizenship. Since the envoy didn't know Latin, did Claudius switch to Greek? No, he said, boom, you're done, you're gone, poof, out of here, revoked, citizenship is revoked. That seems like a pretty big deal to me. Suetonius Tranquillus talks about a Greek soldier and how Emperor Tiberius refused to answer in anything but Latin.
Woe unto Tranquillus, then.
And Valerius Maximus talks about how the emperors demanded a response in Latin, even in Greece and Asia Minor, Anatolia. St. Augustine of Hippo, he says the imperial city imposed on subject nations not only her yoke, but her language. Pliny the Elder talks about how many nations and their languages that the might of Rome conquered. Yes, they conquered other languages and turned them into Latin speakers. Why else do you think we have the Romance languages all over the place? And he says how it's a shame for our people to be ignorant of Latin. And he degrades Greek. Even John Lithos in the mid-6th century is so disappointed how Latin is being taken away in the empire. And he says that's part of the cause of its downfall. The novella of Justinian talks about this too. Guys, there's so much about language and how there was a change. And Romaboo's downplaying of language doesn't hold any scrutiny when you realize the Byzantines themselves saw it as a big deal. Not just John Lithos, but Constantine Porphyrogenitos. He talks about how it was such a big change with Heraclius. Yes, it was a big deal. And if you know anything about medieval European history, you know that the language divide of Latin and Greek is a gargantuan deal throughout its history. Now, the customs of the imperial were indeed Roman because they had to be. It's the Roman Empire. So obviously, they're going to be Roman. But the funny thing is, the way the actual empire was governed, even though it's clearly Roman, was much more in the Greek ethos. The Basileus reflects the Mycenaean kingship in Homer. There was this classicist who was reviewing a book by Anthony Caldelis on the way the empire was governed. And the person said that they weren't familiar with the Byzantine period, but they are familiar with antiquity, especially Greek antiquity. It reminded them as well of the Homeric kingship and the relationship between like Agamemnon and Achilles, and how that kind of reflected how the people and the king's relationship was. And the classicists quoted a bit of Homer to exemplify this, and funny enough, that exact quote was used by Nikitas Koniates in the same fashion. That quote is so badass. Especially, like, read Koniates, and in the context of that quote, so badass with everyone saying it at one time in unison while the dude's getting crowned. Oh, so cool. Anyway, shut up, skase puli. Skase pulia. They reformed a lot of their military to be remodeled after the ancient Macedonian and even classical Greek ones. But the army is still extremely Roman in its ethos, so I'm definitely not saying that, but it did have more Greek elements than before, even though it is still very, very Roman in its ethos and adaptability. Byzantine architecture is really unique, and it's very different than the rest, especially with the Hagia Sophia. That was the first of its kind, right? And even though that was designed by two Greeks, it's not really Greek architecture. It was definitely a continuation of the Roman style before them. So even though it is based off of Greek architecture, it has more distinct Roman characteristics like domes, archways, vaults, etc. But Roman architecture is called Greco-Roman architecture because it's based off of Greek architecture with a few of their own variations. Now, the religious shift did create a big difference in that it was more about, at least with the temples, inward beauty instead of outward beauty, because it was heaven on earth inside. So it was reflected to look heavenly on the inside and to keep you inside the temple. That was the point. You want to go inside. So the interiors are much more decorated than the exteriors, even though those were as well. This is mainly for religious buildings, though. The civil buildings, definitely in the capital, were much more traditionally Greco-Roman and inherited off of Roman architecture. It's a Roman inheritance. But when it comes to the countryside and homes, that's all local stuff. So that, for the most part, is Greek. Not only was both the music and the instruments completely Greek, but even Old Rome took Greek instruments and Greek music wholesale and adopted it. The organ, bagpipe, aulos, pandura, they were all used in the Byzantine period, and a lot of these instruments are still used in Greek music to this day.
Now, these are just the instruments that I've shown that are inherited from ancient Greece, but that's not including all the innovations or other instruments that came afterwards, like the bowed lyra out of the east or the oud, right? But just like in ancient Greece, a lot of the instruments actually came from the Middle East and then went westwards via Greece.
Again, I have to recommend Faria Faraji, and check out his channel. He's got amazing topics on Byzantine, ancient Greek music, ancient Roman music. He is the best channel and the #1 for this topic. So again, I'll link him in the description down below so you guys can go check him out after this. Now, dances are local, so for the most part Greek. Even today, they still have dances inherited from the classical period and before that. But even in the capital, we see dances that are clearly of the Greek style. The old Romans, the Latin Romans, weren't really a dancing culture, and they didn't really emphasize it as much as the Greeks and the Byzantine period does. Now, Constantinople is known for its markets, and so obviously because it's a giant hub, it would be much more diverse in its food than in other places. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, Garam's Roman. Well, Garum is ancient Greek, Roman, and Phoenician. So it's really just a Mediterranean thing. That's like one country claiming olive oil. Sorry, it's a Mediterranean thing. The same thing with Garum. But Andrew Dalby in his book Taste of Byzantium comes up with the same conclusions pretty much that I did. It's a synthesis of Roman and Greek. It's Roman in their love of foreign spices, but very Greek in its love of fish and seafood. And he also acknowledges the clear fact that most food is local and thus would be Greek. Now, clothing changes the most, but it was still Greek, both in what was inherited from Greek culture of the past and the essence and the nature of Greek clothing and culture, which is a mix and a taking of things East and West and putting it together and making it their own. And that was what it was in the medieval days just as much as it was in the past. A lot of taking from Persia. And even Liutprand, who was trying to calm the Byzantines' rage down, said, well, you changed your clothing. You're all Greek now. So he even admits that the clothing is Greek. And even Vespasiano de Bastici, at the very end of the empire, he mentions the fancy hats and the fancy silks that we all know is very Byzantine, but he also notes how it looks very classically Greek, and he was blown away by how ancient it looked, and he was impressed that they were able to keep their same clothing for over 1,000 years. And if you look at Italian paintings of that time when they're showing Greeks, it totally matches the description of Vespasiano and what we know from the Byzantines themselves. It definitely has items that are inherited from Persia that are very late medieval in their form, but also very, very Greek in their essence and nature. These foreign pieces and modern pieces are Hellenized and naturalized. Even the armor of the military had a much more Hellenistic flair than even the old Roman flair, even though those two are very close. But one example of this is round dome shields that are very characteristic of Greek shields. They're domed like the Macedonian ones, and some of them even have a ridge like the classical Greek hoplite aspis. Even the military manuals try to tie in the ancient Greek armament with their own. A lot of them talk about, after their own armament, the armament and what they can take from the ancient Greeks and Romans. But other ones, like Emperor Leo the Wise, his manual only mentions the Macedonians and the armies of Alexander the Great. He doesn't even mention the old Romans. He just shows what we can learn and take from the Macedonian army. Jewelry, including the imperial styles and pieces, were Hellenistic, which incorporated a lot of colored jewels. Thus, it was distinctively Greek. Now, Greek and Roman art styles were essentially the same, but again, we have to remember that the Romans took and copied the Hellenistic styles and the Greek styles. And it's impressive. Sometimes you can't even tell the difference between Hellenistic frescoes and Byzantine ones. The only reason I was able to tell was because of the Thyreal shield. That was it. That was the only reason why I knew this was Hellenistic and not Byzantine. There's even a glass bowl that looks like Southern Apulian Greek art of the classical and Hellenistic periods.
Now, one could definitely counter this argument and say that all the old Roman arts and frescoes looked identical to Hellenistic art styles, and that some Byzantine art, like the Cappadocian arts, for example, are very crude and look hardly anything, for the most part, like ancient Hellenistic artwork. And while that is true, for the Cappadocians, it can be noted that they were on the fringes of the Greek world, and also a lot of them were just not as skilled as other artisans that came from Constantinople. But when it comes to the old Romans, they knew fully well that it was Greek art, admittedly so, and a lot of times they would hire Greek artists to paint these frescoes. And there's also the fact that at the end of the Western Roman Empire, we see the art style change drastically from the Hellenistic or classical styles.
But the real key here is the people shown in the art are always Greek. They're never old Roman. If it's not religious, mythological Greek characters, or Alexander the Great. No Julius Caesar, no Scipio Africanus, only Greek. Especially the ivory caskets, they show so many Greek legends and myths. The literature, unlike what that one Roma booth says, was Greek. Homer was known to all, and everyone knew these stories. And it doesn't matter that the Romans of old knew about these stories are still Greek. Everyone here knows Homer stories. Does that make the Iliad and the Odyssey American? No, of course not. Malaka. And as far as I'm aware, they didn't really translate anything that was originally in Latin into Greek. If anyone knows, please put in the comments down below, because I haven't been able to find any. Tales and myths, Greek full stop, okay? Gorgons were popular as charms and amulets. Centaurs and other characters were shown in stone and in manuscripts. All the characters of Greek mythology were known, from the most educated person down to the common jailer. 10th century, Joseph Genesios talks about how Emperor Basil I was raised like Achilles was with the centaur Chiron. It does give mention to the Persian princess Mandani, but he gets the story wrong, so it probably shows too that he wasn't as familiar with the Persian story than with the other Greek stories. Let's read a little bit from the story of Digenes Acrites, a hero in his own right who is half Roman and half Arab. Let's read some things that they say. They were amazed, like, oh, what's that? Odysseus. Oh, look at that. When in the ship, he heard the siren songs. Look at that. Odysseus and the sirens. And at dinner, his wife would sing, oh, the songs of nightingales are sirens. So when they talk about death, look at that. Oh, Thanatos, Charon, and Hades. These three man killers. Hades, Thanatos, and Charon. Greek mythology. These are very Greek ways of speaking about death. I'm sorry. And Digenes is based off of Heracles, for crying out loud. Samson and Heracles.
Now, I understand fully well that mentions of the sirens, Odysseus, and even Hercules, which is the Latin version of Heracles, were known to the Romans, and they talked about them all the time. I understand that. But again, they knew it was Greek mythology and Greek stories, admittingly so. The origin was Greek. They knew this. And so, therefore, this is a Greek inheritance and not a Roman one.
It is. I know this is early 408 AD, but look at this. Synesius the Cyrene, in a letter, he's writing about how his flock, they literally think that the emperor is Agamemnon. And they're like, oh, he's got a friend named Odysseus. He took out the eyeball of the Cyclops, of the Cyclops, ne? And they're laughing like as if it happened yesterday. That's what the bishop is writing about. And then just read the satirical Timadion. It was written in the 12th century. That is as Greek as you can get. He spends his time talking to people from the Greek past, the classical Greek past. So Timadion, he temporarily tells how he went to Hades and he met all these people that he knew in his time and ancient Greeks, right? In mythology and in real life. And as he's walking in Hades, he sees a court case being finally finished, and it's Brutus and Cassius murdering Julius Caesar. But he says, I didn't hear what the verdict was because I didn't care. I was too busy thinking about myself. So even then, he's just like, I don't care. He spent all his time talking to the ancient Greek philosophers, but then when it was Brutus and Cassius, he's like, I don't care. I was nervous. I didn't care. Yeah, I tell you what, don't look good for the Roma booze. So the Romans always took pride in their military, and even Liutprand of Cremona admits that the army of the Greeks is Roman and it's from Rome. So he even admits that. It is part of the Imperium after all, the military, right? And that is what is Roman. So the military is Roman because it has to be. So obviously there would be heroes in there from the old Roman Republic for the military, obviously.
Their heroes were all either Christian saints or the ancient Romans. The Christian part of their ethos is well known, but you'd be surprised at how many of the old Republican heroes appear in the Byzantine tales. Nicephorus Phocas invoked Scipio Africanus in his speeches before battle. The Bishop of Antioch called men to discipline by reminding them of Manlius Torquatus.
As you can see, I need to de-stress a bit. Stress balls don't work. This is where I get, honestly, a little mad. This is so dishonest and selective to say that the only heroes are saints or specifically Roman military heroes. That is so dishonest. Heroes aren't only saints and military figures. Yes, Manlius Torquatus is quoted, and a lot of Roman boos love to use this, but beside the fact that this took place before the Hellenization of the empire, took place in the 500s, a bigger thing has been revealed here. I do not believe for a single second that what he has on screen, he read. He didn't read any of these sources. You know why? Because that's not what the sources talk about. These sources that he has, they're not citations for mentions of Republican heroes. They're just areas where speeches are. That's it. And only two of them have speeches that include a Republican Roman. The one of Manlius Torquatus and one from Nicephorus. The ones that he mentions and says out loud are the only ones that have a mention. And the rest that he has here, saying that, oh, this is where Republican Roman military heroes are mentioned. No, they're not. They're just speeches done to the army. At random. Some of them even talk about Greeks like Ajax. So it has nothing to do with it. So I don't think he read them. And here's the hilarious part.
Nicephorus Phocas invoked Scipio Africanus in his speeches before battle.
Yes, he talks about Scipio, but guess what? He talks crap about Scipio. Like, that's how you know the guy didn't read it. Like, read it. It shits on everyone from the past. That's the point of it. It's basically saying, them Romans and ancient Greeks, they were weak and pathetic. They had weak enemies. You know what, Homer? Stop writing about Troy and start writing about how much blood we're going to spill these Arabs over here on Crete, baby. Like, that's what it's saying. Like, it's a motivational speech before one of the biggest raids of the century. Like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I honestly do not believe he researched any of this and came up to his own conclusions. I think he copied and pasted these references from like a blog somewhere, and it would explain why these don't make sense, and they're random, the references, like 3.12 and 2.8 reference either book 6 chapter 12, and sometimes those same numbers mean, chapter 8 section 12 or something like that. Then the source is just a random page number. It's like page 306 of what? Like which edition? So I don't even think he knows. I don't think he read them. And that's such a shame that he's going and talking about this when he hasn't even looked at the sources. Because when you do look at him, it doesn't say anything remotely what he's talking about or in his favor. And he mentions Nicetas Caniades as proof of the mentions of the old Roman republics. Obviously, they don't. He's the one who mentions Ajax in a speech. But the funny thing is, Nicetas Caniades is used to show how they identified as Greeks. Like, that's the hilarious part. He is the most pro-Hellenic guy of his era. So it's just mind-boggling. Absolutely mind-boggling. Most of these sources show the exact opposite. Skase parakalo. Skase parakalo. So Constantine Porphyro Genitos, in his work De Thematibus on the themes, he gives the honorary title Perionymos to 3 people. Perionymos means far-famed, known by all. Like everyone knows who this person is, they're famous. And he gives it to 3 people. Emperor Basil I, Julius Caesar, and Thucydides. Now, anyone remotely familiar with Byzantine and Roman history, the first 2 are a given. Basil I is the founder of the Macedonian Renaissance and dynasty, and that's when the empire finally went to its second golden age. And that is Constantine's grandfather. So obviously, he's known to all. Julius Caesar, he's the first emperor of the Roman Empire, their empire. So that's a given. He's their father and progenitor of their nation. But Thucydides is not a given. Like, that one seems pretty random to me. Now, Thucydides was known for 2 things. He was a general and the writer of the history of the Peloponnesian War. So either he's famous and well-known to all because he's a general and thus a military hero, or it's because everyone's familiar with the history of the Peloponnesian War and its characters and heroes. Either way, it disproves Romabu's point and Caldelus's point. And like, Achilles was so popular that the Suda mentions him throughout it, but it doesn't even have its own page dedicated to him because he's just that well known. It'd be redundant to have a page with Achilles. And Kasdan mentions, even though he was too warlike, that instead of just getting rid of him, they changed his character, or they emphasize his other traits of him being more of an artist. So Achilles is so important to the culture that they made him more reflect the values of their day than to just get rid of him. That shows you how much Achilles was prized. Anyway, now let's read the letters of Leon of Synada. He was a man of the 10th century. Late 10th century, he wrote all these letters, right? The last decade. So let's see this. Oleus Synada, he mentions, the Polydeuces, which are Greek and Roman demigods. But the Romans, Lucullus. He does mention Romans. I guess wait a minute. 1 second. In this letter, he says that Nicetas, bishop of Athens, he just casually says that he's inspired by God and the Muses, figures of Greek mythology. Oh, Anaximenes. And then look at this. Oh, his letter to Michael the Magister. Who does he mention? Euripides and Nestor. To the Patriarch of Antioch, Socrates, and he goes on to talk about that wise old Hellene and his wife and all that. And look at this. Arsenios of Heraclea. He mentions Plato and Alcibiades. Oh my goodness. Then Sophocles and his quote. He says, I'm going to give you a quote by Sophocles. Here it is. To Genicus, he mentions Diogenes. So Leonis Sonata makes 12 references to people of mythology or real life people and famous people. Literally only one of them is Roman. The rest are Greek.
Now what's interesting here is that these letters show that these characters must be well known to be mentioned in multiple letters to multiple people, right? There's no real introduction with a lot of these people. They're just assumed to be known, right? Now that does include the old Latin Roman Lucullus, and for the army, Scipio and Pompey and Caesar and such. But the fact that the vast majority of these characters were Greek figures and not old Roman figures or Persian or what have you shows what was more known to the Byzantine populace.
Like, I just found these letters one day and I just decided to read them and I found them. I wasn't looking for Greek and Roman heroes. Look at this. Oh yeah, George Kedrinos, he mentions Agesilaus, king of Sparta, for being a model of ethical action because, he didn't diddle a little boy or he didn't kiss a little boy. Oh wow, he held back his pedophile. And then he mentions Alexander the Great and Cyrus. Oh, he mentions Cyrus. Is it Persian now? Well, chop, Timothy Dawson. If perchance you wish to exempt certain pagans from punishment, my Christ, may you spare, for my sake, Plato and Plutarch. Ioannis Maripus. John Blackfoot. 11th century. Look at this. Diogenes Laertius. He's like saying he's such a hero. Forget about the other heroes. Forget about Achilles and Homer. Write about Diogenes. And then he just mentions Alexander and fanboys over him. But notice how all these heroes are Greeks. Look at this. Oh, he fights an Amazon woman. King Alexander brought from the Brahmins, from the Indians. Here's a description of Diogenes' houses, mosaics, and frescoes, right? They have Samson and David from the Bible, and Goliath and Saul, biblical figures. And then Achilles, fair Agamemnon, Penelope the wise, Odysseus' wondrous daring of the Cyclops, Leophoron, slaying the fiery Chimera, Alexander's triumphs, rout of Darius, and then Kandake, her queenship and her wisdom. Black Queen. Not Greek, but not Roman either. Then the coming of the Amazons and other feats of Alexander. Then Moses and Joshua and the Jews and much else in those two dining halls with gold mosaics Diogenes depicted. I mean, guys, are we reading this? Did you see Julius Caesar on there? Did you see Scipio Africanus? Anything with Pompey and Octavian? No, you don't. Diogenes Laertius is a part of Greek and Byzantine folklore, not like some high-level like literature of the learned, right? And this is what they're talking about, because this is what people know about. The fable Drusilla and Charicles, what do they talk about? All these Greeks. And then they start talking about the works of Phidias, Zeuxis, and Praxiteles, the finest creators of sculpture, right? That's what they're talking about. So this would kind of presuppose that in this story that people know who those guys are, those famous ancient Greek artists. Otherwise, they wouldn't mention it in a story for the average Joe and mention it so highly. If for every quote Roma Boot shows of a Roman, there's like 1,000 more of Greeks. This is not even all of it, guys. This is just a little bit. The references that Roma Boot talks about are so minor that it doesn't tell you anything about their culture. And it doesn't tell you about the culture of the everyday person, more of the imperium. I can give you just as many quotes about Cyrus the Great and Princess Mandani as I can about the Romans. Does that make the Byzantines now Persians? No. So those multiculturalists, don't even think about it. Just because there's mentions of other cultures doesn't mean that they're multicultural. But that's what those goobers do. It's unbelievable.
Now, let me be clear. I am not saying that the old Latin Romans were not a part of their identity. They obviously were. They were their political ancestors and the progenitors of their very nation that they were proud enough to call themselves by. But that does not mean that they shared in the same culture as them. Now, of course, it was mixed in there, but it does not mean that they just embraced it fully and that their own culture that they were proud of disappeared.
Those books that he cherry picks quotes about, old Roman heroes and figures, they tell you what the Byzantine culture actually is. That's the crazy thing. And guess what it's not? I'll give you a hint. It's not multicultural. Paideia means training, teaching, education, and its result, mental culture, learning, and education. But it can refer to the culture in general, but generally with a focus on the educational side of culture. Leo the Wise talks about how his father assimilated the rest of the Slavs in Greece, and he calls it Grekosas. Now, most scholars interpret this word, Grekosas, as meaning having been made Greek, like another word for Hellenizing. But is this right? Because some people say it just means that they learn the language. Now, you could say I happen to find all the Greek stuff and just by chance, and all the Roman stuff I happen to miss. But again, I'm not the only one who believes this, because a source that agrees with me is Theophanes the Confessor in the same book that Romabu used to prove the old Roman-centric theory. It says, she, Irene, sent the eunuch and notarius Elisias to teach her, the daughter of Charlemagne, the literature and language of the Greeks, and to instruct her in the customs of the imperium of the Romans. It says, «Τάτε των Γρεκών γράμματα και την γλώσσαν και παιδεύσε αυτήν τα ήθη της Ρωμαίας βασιλείας». There you go. It doesn't say Greek language and Greek literature. It says of the Greeks. Ton Grekon. Grekon. Of the Greeks. And the imperium of the Romans. The Paideia of the Roman imperium. Right? So the daughter of Charlemagne, to become Byzantine, is taught the imperium of the Romans and the literature and the language, the culture of the Greeks. Grekon. But wait. The Histories by Michael Ataliades. He talks about how there's a certain man, a certain Petros Libellius, an Assyrian from Antioch in the 11th century, and how he reaches the farthest heights of Roman wisdom and education, or Paideia. Akros dexis kymenu tin de Romaikin Sophian και παιδεύση. Now it's obvious in a work that talks about the decline of the Roman military in his day would glorify the old Roman military people of the past, right? The old Romans. That makes sense. But Roman education, Roman wisdom and Paideia, I guess it isn't Greek, is it? Forget it. Maybe he's right. But Michael Ataliades had a certain colleague, and Ioannis Skylitzes, John Skylitzes. He wrote the famous Skylitzes Chronicle, but he also wrote a lesser-known chronicle called the Skylitzes Continuatus, a continuation of that chronicle. And in that continuation, he mentions the exact same Petrus Libellius, and almost word for word says the same thing, that he reached the farthest heights of Paideia. But he doesn't use Roman. The word he uses is Hellenic. Πέτρου του Λιβελισίου άνδρος τίντε των Ασσυρίων και την των Ελλήνων παιδείαν ακρός εξής κειμένου. Here, Roman means Greek in this sense. They are synonymous. And the same with Grekos, with Theophanes the Confessor. They all mean the same thing. Greek, Hellenic, education, Paideia. And we know that Grekos means Hellene. It's synonymous with Hellene. Hesychius of Alexandria talks about it. The Suda talks about it. John Zanaris talks about it. All the lexicons say that Grekos is synonymous with Hellene. They are not exactly translated like Romabu claims. Just like the different words for race and tribe and language, they're synonyms, but they might stress certain features and certain characteristics more than others. But nevertheless, they are synonyms. Shut up! Theophanes the Confessor even talks about Hellenic education. Theophanes Continuatus, the continuation of Theophanes, talks about Hellenic education in a good light. And even the Book of Ceremonies, Constantine Porphyrogenitos, even talks about Musikis Ellinikis, not Greek music, but Greek education. And he talks about Paidias Ellinikis, Hellenic Paideia. Lubrin talks about the Bulgarian king Simeon was half a Greek because he studied in the philosophy schools of Constantinople the rhetoric of Demosthenes and the logic of Aristotle. And there was a school of philosophy in Constantinople where they learned philosophy, mostly Aristotle, some Plato, but still The Greek philosophy school was there for that kind of education and that thinking. In the life of Constantine Cyril, which is St. Cyril of St. Cyril Methodius, they even call him the philosopher. And he talks about how it came from them, all the arts. And finally, after Liutprand was imprisoned, to calm their rage, the Byzantines' rage, right, of being denied being Roman, he tells them, you changed your language, customs, and dress. And the most holy pope thought that the names of the Romans, like their dress, would displease you. If their customs were traditionally Roman, Liutprand would not tell them that their customs changed and aren't Roman anymore and are Greek in an attempt to calm down their rage so that they don't kill him. Think about it. They were about to kill him. He's like, I'm surprised I'm alive. And to calm him down, he says, well, you change your customs. He wouldn't say that if he... I am not pro-West on this topic, but oh my gosh, guys, give him a break. Liutprand ain't that stupid. I feel sorry for the guy, honestly. In this sense, Grekon, Ellinikis, Romaikis are all referring to the same thing. Greek/Hellenic education. It's the Paideia of the Romans, which are Graikos, and it's Hellenic. So the verdict is clear. When we look at everything, it is clear that the culture of the Byzantine Empire, the medieval Roman Empire, was Greek. Plain and simple. The empire in Greek lands has Greek culture. Shocker. People claim that after the sack of Constantinople, like all of a sudden, Hellenic education and identity just popped up out of nowhere among the educated upper class. They tell you, oh, it doesn't matter what the educated upper class talk about, right? The elites, right? But then when they give a view that supports them, what do they use? Upper class, elite books and references. You cannot claim that it's only the ordinary people that matter, and high society and the elites have no place in the definition of peoples and their cultures, but then flip it around and use those elites and high society only when it benefits you, like when you do with Julius Caesar and the generals quoting old Roman military customs. Yes, Constantinople and the Imperium are Roman, but guess what? That's only a part of the civilization. You're missing 99.9% of the rest. Right? The average Byzantine wasn't living in the Imperium knowing all of the elite stuff. All right? Bringing some senators from Italy over doesn't bring about an entire cultural shift. Only complete and often violent subjugation does that. If the capital of America was moved to Costa Rica and Costa Rican culture became the new American culture, then the new American culture would be Costa Rican culture. But Americans ate beans and rice and had taco trucks before the shift. So it's essentially the same thing. And, country music uses guitars, just like Hispanic music. So it's the same thing. If the old Romans valued Greek culture, and admittedly so, why wouldn't the Greeks of the Roman Empire claim that it was their own? It makes no sense. That would have to assume that the Greeks disappeared. That's a video for another day. And again, to the multiculturalists, because I'm not just going to bang on the Romaboos here, right? The multiculturalist, that is more dumb than anything. Look at, as Farji pointed out, Greek culture has always been a fusion of East and West. Look where it's located. That matters. Geography matters, especially in those days. And if you look at Greek culture from the Archaic Age and before that, especially in the Bronze Age and the Minoan Mycenaean period, it is clearly influenced from Egyptian culture. Does that make Greek culture Egyptian? No, it doesn't. Every culture takes from other cultures. That's how you make it your own. You can't just pop it out of thin air. It has to come from somewhere. And that's what the Byzantine period was. It was, again, a fusion between East and West and then Hellenizing and naturalizing it. No culture is its own monolith. And it would make no sense for the one people, aside from the Jews, that resisted Latinization to all of a sudden completely lose their culture once they take a hold of the Roman Empire. They now have full control over it. No one has to force them to assimilate. But then all of a sudden they give it up? Makes no sense at all. Like, it's ridiculous. And I normally wouldn't talk about this if it wasn't so prevalent these days. But it's just unbelievable how little Byzantine fans research where these views are coming from. Not even just looking up themselves. Like, does it bother anyone that these are revisionists? Like, it's crazy. And the whole basis, even though it's wrong for the West to say you're not Roman because your culture isn't Roman, but already on that basis, it shows that there was a difference and that they weren't like Old West Roman in their culture. If they were Roman in pretty much every way except language, and even that wasn't a big deal, then the West wouldn't have one leg to stand on. They wouldn't have been able to make an argument against them in the first place. So in the first video, we proved that the outsiders saw them mainly as Greek, and if they did view them as Roman, they viewed them as Greek and Roman most of the time. And now that their culture was clearly and definitely proudly Greek. So now all that's left is what they ethnically were and saw themselves as. We know they saw themselves as Romans, but what did that mean? But that's a different topic for another video. All right, guys, thank you. My back's killing me. Sorry this took a long time to do. And guys, share this at least to get the misinformation and bullcrap out of here. This is no harm to the personal character of Romaboo. But yeah, if I see lies and fabrications, I'm going to call it out. So that's it. See ya. Oh my gosh, my back. Ah, my neck, my back. Not gonna finish that.